Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the Technology, Innovation, and Global Security Speaker Series. It's a pleasure having you here. This is the third in a series of events this semester that the Technology, Innovation, and Global Security Program of the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law has offered. We've had a wonderful series of speakers. Our success thus far promises to be matched or even exceeded by tonight's speaker. And without further ado, I'm going to ask Bill Spencer, my colleague in the class that is some of whom I see at this event, will do the honors of introducing Joan Woodard. So without further ado, Bill Spencer.
Ken's a much classier act than I am, so I'm going to cut down on that. But before we start, as those of you who are students realize, we have assignments for each of these speakers who come in. And one of the teams tonight has a survey which they would like you to fill out and hand in at the end of the meeting. So I'm going to ask them to do that before I introduce Joan. It isn't often, at least it hasn't been in my career, you get the pleasure of introducing somebody that you work with and have grown to admire, and someone who's been extremely successful. And that's my opportunity tonight in introducing Joan. Joan is a fellow Missourian, at least almost. She grew up in St. Louis, and the rest of the state sometimes wondered whether St. Louis was part of Missouri or not, but we'll pass it over. She graduated from what was Rolla School of Mines when I was a youngster. It's now the University of Missouri in Science and Technology. It's become a very prestigious place in the edge of the Ozarks, and an outstanding school, and Joan was an outstanding student. She's currently the Executive Vice President and Deputy Director of Sandia. As you know from those of you who are in class, from the review we had on Sandia, it's a large national laboratory, about 8,000 employees and about 12,000 altogether with the consultants who are there. Joan's been in a leadership role in Sandia National Labs for over a decade. She currently runs the nuclear weapons program. She received, after a bachelor's degree from Missouri University, she got her master's degree from Stanford, and then under the careful eye of a number of us at Sandia, her PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of California at Berkeley. She's had an opportunity to work in many aspects of not only nuclear weapons, but also of energy, environmental issues, thermal issues, and so it's a great pleasure for me to introduce a young associate, Joan Woodard. Joan, nice to have you here.
Well, good evening. So we won't tell you the stories about the corporate cup race in California with Bill and I both on the Sandia team that was recruited Friday afternoon for the Saturday morning race, and we were under the gym, under the stands at UC Berkeley Stadium practicing how to hand off batons for the relay race. Actually, and the thing that Bill reminded me of, so there's this, of course, there's always rivalries between institutions. Right? University of Texas doesn't have any rivals, do you? Right. So one of our rivals, of course, is the other national labs, Lawrence Livermore in particular. And Bill reminded me that even with our last-minute recruiting and last-minute training for the corporate cup races, we ended up beating Lawrence Livermore, which was really a big deal. Well, listen, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the kind introduction. I hope you find the discussion this evening to be quite interesting. I, for one, have found doing the research and pulling together current information to be quite fascinating. It's quite a challenging topic. So as Bill said, I've worked for a number of decades now in the area of national security research and development, ranging from the energy independence work of the 70s, so the first time we pursued that during the OPEC oil embargo era, to the strategic missile defense program The first one, again, that was back in the 80s under Ronald Reagan and the so-called Star Wars program. Energy and environment, as well as now post 9/11, the singular effect that it's had on domestic security and what we have to do there in terms of new systems and capability. And one thing that I have found myself over that many years doing is occasionally thinking about, and in fact longing for, my college calculus class. And in particular, my college calculus textbook. So I see a mathematician in the audience smiling there. So there's a very interesting feature about calculus textbooks, and that is that there are answers at the back of the book. And there, many a time sitting for hours struggling, trying to solve and derive the solutions to problems, I found myself encouraged. In fact, really with the tenacity that came with knowing that there was an answer in the back of the book. Dummy, so you'll get the answer. Just keep working at it. Well, the challenges today in international security require that same tenacity. Tenacity that comes from knowing, though you may feel like we're looking at and working what seem like impossible problems to solve, that there is an answer and there has to be an answer, and we just need to keep working on them to find them. So let me first talk about the today and today's situation, and what better time than to be in the silly season of a presidential election, right? And so today, the threat associated with nuclear weapons, nuclear materials, nationally, internationally, is receiving a lot of attention. So first, let me talk to you about Senator McCain. I think I've just lost the microphone, but I'll be loud. Senator McCain, actually in his speech in May of 2008 in Denver, said, "Today we need to apply our spirit of optimism, energy, and innovation to the crisis that is building for decades and is now coming to a head, the global spread of nuclear weapons. We should stop and think for a moment not only of the perils of a world awash with nuclear weapons, but also for the more hopeful alternative, a world where there are fewer such weapons than here today, and in which proliferation, instability, and nuclear terrorism are far less likely. This is a world that is our responsibility to build." He then goes on and calls for specific steps that include reducing the size of our nuclear arsenal to the lowest numbers possible, reducing and possibly eliminating deployment of tactical weapons in Europe, working with China toward nuclear arsenal reductions and toward moratorium on production of fissile material in China, continuing America's current moratorium on testing, and taking another look at the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and seeing if we can overcome some of the shortcomings to achieve ratification. And then finally, to strengthen existing treaties as well as to create new ones where necessary. On nuclear energy, he calls for a plan for nuclear energy expansion with calling for a goal of 45 new plants by 2030. And then we go on to Senator Obama. And in his speech at Purdue University, dated July 16, 2008, he calls for, quote, "rid the world of nuclear weapons and pledge to fight emerging threats. Eliminating all nuclear weapons, but not commit the United States to giving them up while others still retain them." Calls for increased pressure on Iran and North Korea, strong and increasing sanctions if they refuse to verifiably abandon their illicit nuclear weapons program. He also calls for seeking to secure nuclear weapons materials and nuclear materials in 4 years, and to increase the funding by $1 billion a year to make sure that nuclear weapons are removed from vulnerable states around the world. And on nuclear energy, Senator Obama calls for improving safety and the environmental impact of nuclear power. Over the last few years, probably having the most profound effect on the debate about things nuclear is a series of 2 op editorials by 4 quite famous statesmen. These were in the Wall Street Journal in January of 2007 and January of 2008. The 4 statesmen are George Shultz, former Secretary of State, William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, and Sam Nunn, former Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman. In the first editorial, which was entitled A World Free of Nuclear Weapons, they talk about tremendous dangers and talk about the importance of rekindling nonproliferation. They call for practical steps for reducing nuclear danger, including increasing warning times, reducing stockpile size, eliminating short-range weapons in Europe. They call for highest standards of security for weapons and weapons-grade material, cessation of fissile material production, and resolving regional conflicts that give rise to new weapons. In the January 2008 editorial, they talk about us being at what they call, in quotes, a nuclear tipping point. Near-term steps are needed. They again outline extending the key provisions of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty of 1991, further reductions in the 2002 Moscow Treaty levels for the stockpile, increased warning and decision times for ballistic missile launch, negotiate cooperative, multilateral ballistic missile defense and early warning systems, providing for the highest levels of security for weapons and materials, and for a dialogue with NATO and Russia about consolidation and elimination of forward deployed weapons, and then finally ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The world picture is a very interesting one. So if you look at today, depending on how you count, I show here actually 8 nuclear weapons states. Some may include a 9th, I'll mention that in a minute. But we have the original 5 nuclear nations of US, Russia, China, the UK, and France. Those are the so-called P5 nations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have other nations that would have, in fact, declared their capability through tests, that is India and Pakistan. And we have a state of North Korea who has done a test, and now it's not clear. You almost have to look at the news every day to know whether they're proceeding with dismantlement or are stalling on their dismantlement under pressures and sanctions. The other additional nation that some might include on a map is Israel, which neither confirms nor denies their existence of nuclear weapons. And so this world view and the world dynamics continues to change. Now let's move over to the area of nuclear energy. Oh, actually, before we do that, let me just talk about these individual nations. So let me go through the P5. So the United Kingdom actually is recently, and I'll talk a little bit later about this in their white paper, but they have made a governmental decision to invest a substantial amount of money in rebuilding infrastructure and a decision to continue to maintain their independent nuclear deterrent. France similarly has made that decision, and there was a recent paper that came out from France I'll talk about again later. But they are deploying a new air-launched and submarine-launched weapon system in the dates and timeframes I've shown there. A new submarine added to their fleet, and their arsenal is being reduced in numbers, as well as the UK. Russia continues to actually grow their investment in military. They announced in 2007 a tremendous expansion of investment in their military overall, conventional as well as nuclear. But we see in their nuclear weapons side actually a fair amount of investment in new capability and delivery systems and the associated warheads. And then finally, China. China is actually doing a fair amount in modernization of their nuclear forces today. They're fielding 2 new missile systems, intercontinental range ballistic missile systems, as well as introducing a submarine-launched element to their nuclear deterrent and nuclear stockpile capability. So now, if we go on and take a look at nuclear power, so what does that picture look like? Some 400+ reactors around the world in a whole range of countries, as you can see, representing 17% of the world energy supply. And the interesting thing about this is if you look, there are nations like the United States with roughly 20% of our energy coming from nuclear, and countries like France and Japan, which are upwards of 70% or more of their energy coming from nuclear power. But then if you go on and look at the dynamics in this picture, you find some interesting aspects. So first of all, there are a number of nations who are considering additions to their nuclear power fleet. There are also a number of nations considering their first nuclear power plant. And this is actually dated in March of '08 from a report that came out from I think it's actually the Nuclear News. And we have, some nations that are considering dismantlement and in fact have decommissioned their last plants, like Italy. So a pretty interesting dynamic picture. Then actually in May of 2008, in a Washington Post article, they reported that the United Nations just recently issued a statement that at least 40 nations have approached the United Nations to signal interest in starting nuclear power programs. And these range from the Persian Gulf region to Latin America. They include oil and gas-rich nations like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates, and neighboring nations like Libya, Algeria, Morocco, and Jordan, as well as Turkey, Egypt, Nigeria, Namibia, as well as at least 6 of the former Soviet republics. IAEA officials said, quote, "They have never experienced such widespread interest in starting domestic nuclear power programs." So in summary, an extraordinarily dynamic picture with a significant amount of change, but also at the same time domestically and internationally the opportunity that comes with increasing dialogue and debate about policies and actions in support of the addressing of the threats and issues and achieving the increasing benefits from nuclear power. So now, let's see, so for the class, I gave a couple of questions. I think Bill passed some of those on to you, and I'd like to have you help me through this. So the next topic I wanted to talk about is actually analyzing the problem. So if you could help me with this, I think there's really 2 dimensions of the problem. One is the technology, and the other is the global market aspects of the problem. So I'd be interested in class, as well as others who might have something to offer. What are some of the key aspects of this problem that one needs to think about in analyzing it? I'll give you a hint. One of them might be materials. What do we worry about? Gosh, it's a quiet group. But Bill warmed me, huh? Fissile materials. So what are typically fissile materials? Uranium. Okay. So in fact, a particular type of uranium, enriched, highly enriched. So this is a very, whoops, if you go back, go back to the first. If you go back, this is a really simple diagram of the nuclear fuel train. So from mined ore, enrichment, and providing, first of all, the level of enrichment for nuclear power. Same technology for enrichment to higher levels that are nuclear weapons grade. That same technology, though actually the step going from the low enrichment level to high enrichment level is not as much effort as it is to even reach the first level of enrichment at 3%. Then you've got, via the nuclear power production, spent fuel and a chemical separation process away from having plutonium, which is the other major part of fissile material. So you've got 2 distinct material trains with distinct signatures and characteristics, both with a lot of knowledge and other equipment, which I'll show you in a minute, that contribute then to knowledge to be able to create something like a simple nuclear weapon. So what about the other technology? So if you look at that on the next slide, it's everything from centrifuge technology to vacuum pumps, valves, it's neutron generators, it's high voltage switches, it's missile technology that are technologies that represent those key signatures. So in the materials, just to finish up, as we talked about, there's materials in various states too. The original yellow cake ore, and the major sources for uranium in the world. Some order of 28% of the world's uranium supply is in Canada. Not South Africa, but the continent of Africa, another 30%. So there are significant areas of concentration of uranium ore around the world. And then the plutonium, and then fuel rods and pellets. So an interesting set of problems. So now think about, what about the market side of all of this? So the market side of this is really an interesting piece. We have AQ-Khan and an IAEA report on Libya in 2008, actually in September of this year, just recently, talked about Libya tapping into the sophisticated black market network that included AQ-Khan, and that illicit nuclear trade had been around for quite a long time. Another study from the National Defense University team of Bernstein, Caves, and Reichert commented on today's situation and said that small groups and individuals operating outside of traditional political boundaries may be capable of assisting states and terror groups in developing and acquiring nuclear capability. They call this a concrete manifestation of globalization in this area of national security threat. And it's a problem that framers of the Non-Proliferation Treaty 40 years ago did not conceive and anticipate. Increasing global energy demand is a complicating factor, not only because nuclear energy is attractive and appealing because of the geopolitics of oil, but the other key aspect of this global energy demand is that it makes it very difficult to impose hard sanctions against states like Iran, who are chief exporters and not only can manipulate but also influence other oil exporters, creating an important dynamic. In their study, they also go on and talk about other strategic economic factors and considerations. For example, Russia exports a lot of natural resources today, but they also recognize and identify nuclear technology as one of the few technologies that Russia can market competitively internationally. And China's aggressive efforts to pursue and secure energy resources color its posture toward proliferation problems such as Iran. So globalization, global markets are a reality not only for the civilian nuclear side, but also for this black market side. So now let's talk about the history of the nuclear threat and evolution of nuclear control. So let me first read from a declassified secret memo to the President from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Quote, although the principles of nuclear physics underlying atomic explosives are widely known throughout the world, and many technical procedures and manufacturing processes used for atomic weapons are still secret, they call for an effort to forestall a possible race in atomic weapons and to prevent the exposure of the United States to a form of attack against which present defenses are inadequate. Measures should be taken. They call for a public declaration by the President to consider itself bound by the United Nations Charter. Continued discussions nationally and internationally with United Nations organizations as to methods of international control and outlawing the use of atomic weapons and for encouraging the full development of atomic energy for the benefits of mankind. Would you like to guess the year?
47.
It was October 23rd, 1945, literally months, a handful of months after the bombs were dropped in Japan. So it's been a really interesting picture to watch over time. So this is some work actually that came from Reichert, National Defense University analysis, in which he looked at, and I'll walk over here if it's okay, but he looked at the cascade of drivers. So the U.S. perhaps through assistance to the U.K., but also through the competition, Russia acquired weapons. There was also a whole host of nations, and so the code is here that the boxes are those who had weapons programs, who have them. Red is they still have them. Green is they don't. So a number of nations pursued nuclear weapons programs right after Cold War, including nations like Norway and Sweden and Italy. rolled back because of various actions that were taken. Similarly, you have in today's world with the dynamic of Israel, Iran, other nations that are considering. Similarly, you have with key trigger points like Korea and the potential of a network of actions and dominoes, as Reactor refers to it. He then goes forward in his study and he talks about a nightmare scenario. That's the next one. And here he talks particularly about the importance of key nations like Japan and Turkey as trigger points for a domino effect of other nations pursuing nuclear weapons. So you can see actually reaching into South America, as well as Southeast Asia and in the Middle East quite extensively. In his study, though, he also goes on and talks about, so why was it that we've had, as you saw in that previous chart, a number of nations that have actually rolled back programs as well as even rolled back from possession of nuclear weapons? And actually, there are a number of tools that have worked in the past. So the first is alliances. Through the NATO alliance and burden-sharing algorithm and the extended umbrella of nuclear deterrence, through individual bilateral agreements with Japan, Australia, the like. After the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, through something called the NATO Partnerships for Peace, which caused and encouraged Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus to, in fact, give up their nuclear weapons and consolidate them back into the Soviet Union, into Russia. The other major aspect of tools is international and regional cooperation to pressure rollbacks. And so the key examples of that are, in fact, South Africa, which rolled back from their weapons program, and Libya, who rolled back from their weapons program also recently. So let me talk a little bit about the history of international cooperation now. Back in 1945, December of 1945, the United Nations created something called the Atomic Energy Commission. It actually lived just a short period of time, until 1948. Its charter was to consider problems arising from the discovery of atomic energy and related matters. Right around that same time period, the President of the United States created a study group led by Atchison and Lilienthal. And then subsequent to that, that work was turned into a plan by Bernard Baruch, which was presented to the United Nations. That group was chartered, those studies and plans, chartered to draw up proposals to abolish nuclear weapons and for controlling the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Called for an international authority to control and operate all nuclear activities. And they included penalties imposed not subject to the veto of any power in the United Nations Security Council, and with agreement that the U.S. would disarm after this authority was operating effectively. It was, in fact, these last two features, the U.S. the last to disarm and the absence of the veto power, single veto authority in the United Nations Security Council, that caused this plan to not be accepted, particularly by the Soviet Union. So then we go forward through history. That was 45, 46. 1949, in September, the USSR conducted their first nuclear test. Then in 1952, the United Kingdom became the third nuclear weapons state. In April 1952, the President created a panel of consultants on disarmament and to make recommendations on U.S. nuclear policy. Then in August of 1953, the Soviet Union conducted what was believed to be the first hydrogen bomb test. Then in December of 1953, Eisenhower, with the results from this previous panel and work with his advisors, put forward through his speech to the United Nations the Atoms for Peace program. In December of 1954, the UN unanimously endorsed the creation of a new agency that led to the birth of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And it's had three pillars, and does to this day. First is nuclear verification, the second is safety and security, and the third is technology transfer. So now we move forward another decade And we have President then, Lyndon Baines Johnson, in response to a rogue nation that conducted a nuclear test that really deeply troubled the nations of the world, created a commission called the Gilpatrick Commission. The rogue country was Red China, and the year was 1965. The recommendations from this commission was to support multilateral treaties. That particular commission and the subsequent work led to, in fact, the foundation of non-proliferation today, which is the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This treaty there is no other treaty that has more adherents. 190 nations faithfully participating, and with a series of wide-ranging safeguards and inspections that cover over 150 countries. But today this pattern goes on. So we've had subsequent new entrants into the nuclear weapon state category. Today, the U.S. is also facing issues in terms of aging, of infrastructure and stockpile. So there is another commission. Today, it's the Bipartisan Strategic Posture Review Commission, which was established by Congress in 2008 to make recommendations on nuclear policy and posture for the U.S. So as you can see, there's a pattern. It's not new. Virtually every president has faced this complex threat and said, I want to get rid of it, I want to abolish it. But it is extraordinarily complicated. They oftentimes establish a commission, which only government officials can do so well, and find it so complicated that there's not one single answer, but an array of actions. So now let's move on to the area of nuclear international control. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is, in fact, and has been the cornerstone of the non-proliferation regime for some time. There's quite a wide range of signatories, as you can see here. There are, unfortunately, also some non-signatories that do show up there. There are 6 articles in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The first 2 articles have to do with declaring and calling for no transfer or receipt of nuclear weapons or nuclear explosive devices or assistance in the development of nuclear weapons programs. The second calls for IAEA administering safeguards, that is, inspections, remote monitoring, seals, tags, etc. The fourth article calls for IAEA facilitating the development of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. The 5th article is on declaring the availability of that technology on a non-discriminatory basis. And finally, Article 6, which calls for ceasing the arms race and pursuing negotiations on nuclear disarmament. Actually, even more broad than that, it calls for pursuing negotiations on disarmament across the board, conventional and nuclear. There are some other aspects of the non-proliferation regime today. There are things like the Zanger Committee, which is an informal group of nations that have come together to create a trigger list for export control, reviews, and decisions. There's a nuclear suppliers group consisting of 45 nuclear supplier nations that limits exports to non-nuclear weapon states with IAEA safeguards in place. In addition to those aspects of export control, there's also an initiative for interdiction of illegal trade called the Proliferation Security Initiative. And then finally, last 2 pieces, most recently passed by the United Nations in 2004, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540, which most importantly, what it does is it criminalizes WMD proliferation to non-state actors. So the movement from the original creation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in a world dynamic of state-to-state actors, now with the introduction of globalization, marketing, and an illegal black market, there was a significant gap in our overall regime at the non-state actor level. And this resolution calls for nations to take specific measures that will impose criminal penalties on non-state actors at this level. And then finally, other aspects, there's been quite a bit going on in both national and bilateral weapon and fissile material physical protection upgrades. For example, one of the big ones has been the U.S. and Russia Federation Material Protection Control and Accounting Program that continues today. Now, the other aspects of international nuclear control I'll talk about is the role of deterrence. Coincident with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there were a number of additional negotiations and treaties put in place that reduced arms worldwide. Today, some estimates say that the worldwide stockpiles are approximately 25% of what they were at the peak of the Cold War. But what is the role of deterrence? The role of deterrence in non-proliferation is a subject also of a lot of debate. There is an extended umbrella relationship with nations like the NATO nations, former Soviet republics, many bilateral agreements. And for example, let me quote Senator John Kyle in a recent address just last month at the George C. Marshall Institute, where he said that reason for our deterrent is that it prevents a cascade of proliferation because of the nuclear umbrella that the U.S. provides for over 31 nations. For example, the first thing the Japanese government did after the North Korea detonation in 2006 was to call Secretary Rice to get a public declaration that the U.S. continues to extend its protective nuclear umbrella over Japan. So other nations, as I said, the UK white paper and statement by Prime Minister Blair in December 2006 calls for, we believe that an independent British nuclear deterrent is an essential part of the insurance against the uncertainties and risks of the future. France, in the spring of 2008, issued a white paper on deterrence and national security, and in it they talk about the world having changed profoundly, and that in particular with the impact of globalization. The formidable acceleration of information exchanges, the increased trade in goods and services, as well as rapid circulation of individuals, have transformed our economic, social, and political environment in both positive and negative ways, as well as the paradigms of national and international security. They go on in this white paper and say that nuclear deterrence remains an essential concept of national security. It is the ultimate guarantee of the security and independence of France. Russia, in September of this year, actually September 26th, so just a short time ago, the president announced plans to upgrade their nuclear deterrent, calling for a complete modernization of their nuclear deterrent by the year 2030. He indicated that the recent military conflict in Georgia demonstrated to them the need for modernize their armed forces and to upgrade their nuclear deterrent. So a very interesting dynamic picture continues with regards to the role and the affirmation or reaffirmation of the role of deterrence. In the U.S., what is the state? Well, we're in dialogue. There's a bipartisan commission, as I mentioned earlier, that is supposed to report out early next year. There's a nuclear posture review called for by Congress to the administration, next administration in 2009. And there are a number of studies being conducted by different non-government organizations that are looking at the aspects of the nuclear deterrent, nuclear policy, and nuclear deterrent strategy and policy. Let me now move on. So you've had an opportunity for some of you on the class to read a book that I recommended called The Nuclear Jihadist. When I look at that particular case, which as you can see has had a pivotal and profound effect on how leaders around the world think about nuclear proliferation, it is an interesting study in what works and doesn't work. And so I asked you to think about, and I'd now like to engage in a discussion about what you found in that case study, about what worked and didn't work in terms of controls internationally to prevent what was then a cascading set of events that led to proliferation not just in a single nation but in multiple nations. First thoughts? Surely somebody read a few pages. None? All right, go ahead.
I was pretty surprised he was able just to walk into the Dutch lab and walk out
Right, right, yeah. Yeah, in fact, at FDO, Urenco, 3 nations, the rule was that you had to be a citizen, either British, Dutch, or German citizen. And he was given a clearance and access with obviously not even being a citizen. So major breakdown in basic security, basic security. What else? It's a great one. Yeah, uh-huh.
When I read it, and I was curious to know what would happen in the end. But looks like he's not in prison or anything. He's very well protected by his government and has actually high status and he's doing it right now.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in fact, as best I've been able to determine, he's still in a state of being under house arrest in his home in Pakistan. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What else? What other observations from what you were able to read? Yeah.
I was interested in how at the end of the Carter administration, also the Reagan administration, how they downplayed and didn't want to admit that they had a nuclear program as while they're supporting the war going on in Afghanistan.
Right. No, absolutely. In fact, there are 2 great stories there. One was Reagan and the total preoccupation with fighting the Soviet Union, and the theater there was Afghanistan. So we couldn't even hear the information that was coming in that was showing us indications in Pakistan. And the other one, which was almost comical, was perhaps I'm going a little too severe here, but at the end in November of 1979, I think it was. I think that's right, November of 79, that Carter, who was struggling through continuation of the Iranian hostage crisis, at that point, President Zia had actually incited the Pakistani population against the U.S. for an attack that occurred on the Grand Mosque, which there appeared to be no evidence of the U.S. involvement in that. But he incited the population against the U.S. Their mobs stormed the embassy in Pakistan, killed a Marine, destroyed a number of the buildings. And instead of responding, being incensed to the president of Pakistan, Carter called up the Pakistan president and thanked him for his cooperation in working through the Iranian hostage crisis. So it's like we can't focus on more than one issue at a time that is that significant. And we seem to really have significant blinders as a result. So those were great examples. Others? Yeah.
They didn't give credit to some countries or the technology of some countries. At the beginning of the book, when the CIA said that Pakistan maybe was developing a search about nuclear weapons, they don't take into account because they thought that in that country they don't have the technology to develop.
Right. Right, absolutely. Now, in fact, there were a couple of really good examples of real breakdown in the quality of intelligence analysis. And of course, I have to throw this one in. I think this was, let's see, in 1978, the CIA with Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, Z Division, after assessing information that was being gathered about the enrichment program that was allegedly taking place in Pakistan, concluded that this was no threat at all. And so, again, and there was another example where the CIA judged that Khan was not a threat or an issue, and in fact advised, and it was at their advice, that the Dutch government backed off with an attempt to arrest him in 1975, which was a pivotal change, pivotal issue there. Yeah.
2 comments, and I'm sorry if I can't remember on Turkey's, on that nightmare slide you showed. What is the actual black market? It talked about Turkey being the kind of like world's bargaining ground for black market trade.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is that really where some of this concern should be focused? And then also the article, I believe, mentioned that there's been a lot of trying to rewrite of the history of Pakistan about downplaying Khan's involvement and saying that he was only one part of it and just being a metallurger or something.
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So let's see. So if you recall, Turkey was one, but there were other tremendous fertile grounds for the marketing. Dubai was one. Recall that he actually had the Tinner family set up warehouses in Dubai. That was a part of the transit position for technology that was being marketed and purchased and sent to other locales. So it's more than one single place. There are a number of nations, a handful that I can think of. Dubai was particularly highlighted in this recount of Khan's activities. And so you asked about the question of
trying to rewrite the history of Pakistan's nuclear.
Yeah. So let's see. So that I found that part fascinating also. It really called into question in my mind. So why were people acting the way they were acting? So what was really driving Khan? Was it his national, just loyalty to Pakistan? Was it individual greed? Was it jealousy? Because remember that there was another Khan that was the laboratory head at the point when he re-entered Pakistan. He had a long-standing, for decades, rivalry that existed between the two of them. So I wouldn't be surprised, given that latter, that the internal rivalries. If you recall, even for the test that they did conduct, whether it was going to be a Khan device and it was going to be his laboratory, if it was going to be the competing laboratory, and then everybody grandstanding for their publicity and all. I wouldn't be surprised that there's attempts to do a little revisionist history gathering or history creating there. Well, let's see. The other ones that I wrote down here are, first of all, export control. Export control measures and control systems can play a very important role. But there were some significant breakdowns and also one success that was highlighted. Let's see, so there was German vacuum technology in the 1970s that was sold from German companies to Khan, and that should have been caught in the export control regime. One that did work was EG&G Salem and high voltage switches that were being procured. And they were stopped as a result of some alert people, both in the company as well as in customs. There were some breakdowns in diplomacy, where in the 1990s, Bush sent Rowan over to talk with the Pakistani president, to not much avail. In the 1970s, Canada insisted and tried to impose on Pakistan that the reactor near Karachi be put under IAEA inspection, which was in fact a Canadian-supplied reactor, and they were unable to achieve that. And then finally, what I call commercial international trade profit motive. I found it fascinating reading about the Tinner family, Friedrich Tinner and his son Marcos and Urs, who made millions throughout this as arms of Khan's operation, setting up their, being first of all highly trained engineers, and then setting up warehouses and infrastructure in Dubai and elsewhere as a part of that whole effort. So you ask about the current situation under house arrest. Musharraf was inclined to continue to keep some control. With the change of leadership in Pakistan, not clear exactly where that will go. Something very important to watch. Let's see. The other piece that I'll pass on that I found interesting was that just this year, in August of 2008, there was an article in the New York Times that talked about the president of Switzerland finally stepping to the podium in Bern and reading a statement confirming rumors that they had destroyed a huge trove of computer files and other material documenting the business dealings of a family of Swiss engineers suspected of helping smuggle nuclear technology to Libya and Iran. The president said that the files were destroyed so that they would never fall in the hands of terrorists. The article goes on to say that many are alleging that the real reason was that the evidence showed that there was a clandestine relationship between the Tinner family and the CIA. So that significantly undermined then any Swiss or German authorities in cases against the Tinner family. So now let me take you to today, and we'll wrap up here. Today we have some really interesting dynamics. In September of this year, the IAEA issued a report in that they said that, first of all, quote, Iran failed to resolve lingering problems about alleged nuclear weapons research, and that the IAEA, were at a dead end. The report goes on to talk about evidence of foreign expertise in the Iranian program, assisting in Iran's past nuclear efforts, and that further it was not AQ Khan. So how broad and extensive is the network and the web today? Verification is a major issue, has been in the past and is now and will be for some time to come. And in an article that was in the New Atlantis by Henry Sokolsky, he talks about, quote, after the embarrassment of Iran's enrichment program admission in 2003, even the IAEA concedes that there is no reliable way to detect covert nuclear fuel-making plants, nor is there a reliable way to detect significant military diversion from civilian fuel-making plants in a timely manner. It talks about currently the IAEA technically cannot find covert nuclear fuel-making plants. The production of fuel is the long pole in the tent of a nuclear weapon. And it talks about further that the IAEA even lost track of hundreds of kilograms of plutonium at fuel-making plants it monitors in Japan and Europe. So what should we do? What is the challenge? Well, the answers today, I think, is not one silver bullet, but in fact many. First of all, we must manage global expansion of nuclear energy and potential spread of enrichment and reprocessing technology. We need to do so in a way that helps us to achieve civilian nuclear technology expansion, but the results in is going to be huge demand on the resources for control and management. There have been new additions, such as the Next Generation Safeguards Initiative, to address this issue of expanding program. But core to this is significant support, both financially, technically capable staff, as well as significant engagement by all countries with the IAEA to expand and reinforce its role. Second, we must stop, if at all possible, North Korea and Iran. The dismantlement of the North Korean program, on and off again, day to day. North Korea withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That has to be worked very concertedly, and the multi-nation talks are a key piece of that. The suspected Iranian nuclear program, IAEA verifications of the peaceful use asserted by Iran, but Iran refuses to suspend its enrichment program and to allow complete access. A pillar of IAEA effectiveness is access, transparency, and cooperation. And strong, purposeful sanctions and pressure, cooperative pressure, will make a difference, can make a difference. Finally, we need to make the UN Resolution 1540 real. This is really going to be a challenge because we have to assist nations who don't have the adequate capacity or resources to implement this resolution. We also have to focus on mitigating the most significant risks of WMD proliferation. But most important, and this is going to be an interesting challenge, is we've got to overcome the resistance based on allegations nations are making that this measure steps over the bounds of the UN's role and calls for and dictates domestic law for the members. And then finally, we need to continue to encourage and start both voluntary and non-governmental cooperative programs. Programs like some of those coming out of non-government organizations like the Nuclear Threat Initiative that Ted Turner started. They have established now a new cooperative program that is aimed at nuclear security that parallels the cooperative program that has existed for a while in nuclear power and nuclear reactor safety. And then finally, we have a Non-Proliferation Treaty 2010 review conference that's coming up shortly. An incredible opportunity to put new attention and to reinvigorate the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So now, as I hope I have pointed out to you or painted for you, a very dynamic picture with growing trends that do represent significant concern, yet proven from past tools that can work, but they require, first of all, resources, second of all, significant engagement by this nation and other nations of the world, and continued tenacity. So my question to you, and in particular to the students, is you are now the president inaugurated in January 2009. What would you do? Some of you, go ahead.
Well, I think I'd continue to implement the cooperative threat reduction program that that's been going on in Russia, and really focus a lot of time and energy into that before Russia gets out of hand. And then I think another thing I would focus on, in particular with North Korea, is to deter the South Koreans from focusing so much on unification, because that seems to be the priority of the South Koreans right now, is unifying between the North and the South. And by doing so, if North Korea doesn't dismantle its nuclear weapons, then South Korea can easily acquire the nuclear program, giving South Korea, giving East Asia one more, massive nuclear power, unlike, and so I think I would focus a lot of energy on that and making South Korea focus on dismantling North Korea rather than unifying North Korea.
Very good. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the last one. Others? So seeing in particular trigger points with Korea as one of those, similar to the record study.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Something else. What would Al-Qaeda apparently headquartered more in Pakistan than Afghanistan now? How secure is the Pakistani nuclear program from that kind of infiltration? And how do we manage that? Or we have a very tenuous relationship with Pakistan for this? That's just a question I have.
Right. Yeah, so let's see. So all I can say is there's a lot of people who are paying very close attention and have for some time on that question in terms of security in Pakistan. So to me the question is, okay, so there's been significant changes there. I mean, the change in the leadership in Pakistan, and the level that the new president is able to actually control the military versus not are significant issues that we see actually even bubbling up from some of the press coverage today. So what are the right approaches to take with regards to that?
Well, I don't know enough about our relationship with their military or their leadership to know what kind of pressure is reasonable, what we know about their security level. Without knowing some of that, it's hard to speculate.
So the nuclear program in Pakistan is actually controlled by the military rather than the president. And the military has been a fairly stable institution for the last 60 years, unlike the government. So the U.S. has had fairly close relations with the military in terms of cooperation. But again, with the current events, that might be changing. So who knows?
Yeah, Ken.
So this is a question, not a solution. So if you look at actually we probably should use this microphone if it's working. Yes, it is. So if you look at the long history of attempts to control the diffusion of technology, it's not a particularly encouraging history. So historically, attempts to use controls to prevent the diffusion of technology, if you're going back to textile mills coming from England to the U.S. or gunpowder diffusing from China centuries ago, or whatever. It's not a very encouraging history in terms of preventing technology from ultimately diffusing. The lesson from the history that you're telling us about here is that if you're willing to invest enough resources in it, virtually anybody can get their hands, to some extent, on nuclear technology. If there's enough, if you're willing to devote enough resources and you have the scale required, you can do it. So the question I have for you, oh, well, this microphone died again. So going back to the history you tell us about, so one question is, it's not really about, in the end, it's not really about physically preventing the technology from diffusing. You can make it more difficult perhaps, but it's going to be impossible. What it's really about is creating carrots and sticks, incentives, so that the people who can invest that scale of resources, i.e. states, nation states, have an incentive not to do it. And that's why the NPT has worked to the extent it has, because there are carrots and sticks associated, presumably, which induce people to do it. And the concerns you have strike me as questions about whether the balance of incentives and the carrots and sticks are in danger of no longer holding it all together now.
Right.
So my question is, and then going back to the history you described, I read the same book, The Nuclear Jihadist, and my lesson I take away from that is that we were never really very serious about trying to control this. Really, in the case of Pakistan in particular, there was, you can say the intelligence was bad, but clearly there were people in the intelligence agencies who had a pretty darn good idea what was going on. It was just never a priority. There were always things that were more important, right? And you raise questions in your talk about to what extent it was not only been not unimportant, but somebody may have actually made a decision to say, it's not so bad, let it go ahead, they're on our side, whatever. So my question for you is, if you add it all up, it's really about sort of nations making decisions about creating a system with incentives. And what evidence is there that system is in any better shape now? I mean, I know what the answer to this is than it was 20 years ago. And so I'm really curious whether you agree on the inevitability of what money can buy technology in this case, and that what's really required is less walls and barriers around the technology and more sort of a system of political and other incentives for people to sign on to something.
See, first of all, I don't think it is an either or. I think it's an and. I agree totally that it's not just nations, but in fact collaborations and cooperation among nations to engage in creating the environment that causes nations to see that it's less attractive and less desirable to pursue that path than not. So if you look at Reactor's study and the rollbacks that occurred in the 50s and then even later in the 60s, it was because there was, first of all, we were paying attention and watching, so we've got to be doing that, following the technology, continuing to do the best in terms of intelligence. But the second is then, whether it be cooperation in a positive way like alliances, or whether it be cooperation imposing sanctions and pressure on countries to roll back. So engagement. Countries engaging very purposefully and with lots of energy and resources is as pivotal to this.
Well, would you agree with the proposition that the problem, if you look at the example of the Pakistan weapons program, that really fundamentally, we were emitting mixed messages about that over time?
I'm not sure about if I would characterize it as mixed messages, but I agree with your description earlier, that for various reasons we could not see or hear what was really going on there. And I don't know that it's necessarily that we chose not to listen, but I think there was a believability piece about whether we thought a nation, as the individual in the back said, with those resources and general assessment, our assessment of their level of technological prowess could in fact do what they did. We have, that's an aspect of human nature and of this country too, to not necessarily recognize a problem until it's really on us. So the question, I think of that, is will we listen, will we learn from that experience and not have to repeat this again?
Just following up on this, the thinking in terms of the commitment on new non-proliferation policies by the U.S. In the case of Pakistan, it could be political reasons why we decided not to enforce them. But more recently, with the pact with India, which is, although for civilian purposes, but still does not lay any restrictions on the military use of nuclear technology, how deep-rooted is this commitment for non-proliferation, or is non-proliferation regime really a tool that is used in political bargaining or in strategic negotiations?
Yeah, so let's see. So I think there's lots of indicators that you can see that the country's commitment actually for some time now in active measures in non-proliferation have not been either as evident or as strong as the times perhaps called for. But I'm not sure that I would necessarily say it's a question of either or for the India situation. Let's say the India deal, as it's called in the press, is not necessarily one that I would have designed personally, but it's again this question of leadership weighing national priorities between a country that's some 90% fossil fuel dominated for their energy supply, nuclear power technology, nuclear industry, and the health of industry, non-proliferation, and the like, and weighing those judgments and decisions. And so it's no one of these single issues or actions on our part is going to be a single point. Just as I said before, there's not a silver bullet answer for working the international control piece, nor is there a single issue in any of one of these situations, whether it be our ability to see Pakistan for what was really going on or the relationship that has been put in place with India.
How does America deal with a country like Iran who doesn't care about sanctions or international agreements?
So countries act in their own country's self-interest. So how do you think about Iran and what is its self-interest?
I think the theocracy and the president of Iran are more concerned probably with the interest of a small group of Muslims than they are with the interests of the Iranian people. And that's a big disconnect.
So given that, is there a way to analyze and think about what the drivers are that are causing the continued decision processes that we suspect might be going on within the country and things nuclear, and to interdict that?
I'm hoping you have some ideas.
Well, let's see. So one of the things I think about with regards to sanctions in Iran, and I'm far from an expert, there may be people in the audience here who are much more knowledgeable about that, is that sanctions work effectively when you've really got back to the collaboration across a broad number of nations all working in cooperation, and we don't with Iran. We don't have agreement among most of the key nations that would have to come together in a strong collaborative effort to really put pressure in place.
So what does one do in lieu of that? If the stop of proliferation is as important as I think it should be, and as we're paying lip service to, what do you do if Russia is vetoing Security Council agreements?
Well, let's see. So This, as I said before, both Iran and North Korea require enormous concerted effort, and probably stepping up substantially what we're doing today. The question is, in my mind, is whether we're early enough in that process, and establishing the relationships with Russia, reestablishing stronger relationships with Russia in order to be able to come to a common mind about our view of an nuclear-armed Iran is the place where that should have started. And there's quite a long way to go in that regard. But where do we go when we've got nations like that, particularly when you don't have the support? Maybe there's other alliances that can be created. So what are the opportunities for alliances there, even among the Middle Eastern nations? That might be a direction to go.
Israel has stated that its policy towards Iran would be that they will preemptively strike in order to stop them from having a nuclear weapon. Is that generally, like on the whole, like a good strategy for possibly the U.S. to do towards other countries where we would be willing to preemptively strike to prevent countries from starting their weapons program?
Let's see. So the dynamics of Israel there is one that's subject of a lot of press today. I think just about every other day or so we see some sort of statement out of France, President of France, trying to put pressure in place. I find that to be a really troubling situation there because I think anything that happens, we're going to be painted as having been involved, even if we're not. So, do we take when do you take preemptive measures? Again, I'm not a federal official making these decisions, thank God. But to me, diplomacy figures in a substantial way before you ever think about preemptive strike and bringing military means to bear. It's a difficult thing because it's hard to step back. It's hard to step back when you take that measure. And thinking this through, it's like a chess game. One step, a particular type that's a visible military step can lead to cascading steps by others. And seeing where that might play out before you even contemplate the step is extremely important. But in general, again, I'm far from the decision-making expert in that area, or even in anywhere close to those circles. But military steps would be important to think of it as a last resort. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. You.
I was interested to know that you mentioned the non-government programs in the area of nuclear security cooperation. I was interested to know what their stakes are in this and how effective have they been so far in increasing cooperation.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question? I didn't catch the first part.
I want to know the stake of non-government programs in nuclear security cooperation and how effective have they been so far.
Let's see. So they are very, very new in existence. So the one that probably has them is in the nuclear power arena. Has a little longer history is in nuclear reactor safety, and it is largely a cooperative effort by which communities get together and share in implementation of standards and practices and international forums. There's a new activity that has just been conceived, and it's World Institute for Nuclear Security, I believe is the title of it, that came out of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And they are just starting, and that's actually in the security area to complement and to actually use the same model that has been used in reactor safety. And it's around, bringing communities together to create exchange of ideas and best practices. So to say how effective they are, too soon to tell. I'm sorry, I don't even know who had their hands up, but go ahead.
I'm thinking just again in terms of Iran, I mean, one of the things we think of whether you're doing a preemptive strike or trying to prevent things, or whether or not governments work with the interests of the people, is that the plurality of Iranians believe that they have the right to enrich uranium or have nuclear weapons. There's also sort of and the idea of sort of, and a threat against them only sort of backs them up and sort of makes them think they have that right even more so. And you wonder how how strong really is our regime of carrots? I can put it that way. I mean, we think the idea that maybe take a country like Turkey right now, which is sort of on the brink of EU, where it sees the EU membership as some sort of supreme character, some supreme way to get towards economic development, and some type of nuclear proliferation was sort of prioritized in terms of economic incentives, opposed to just sort of being. It seems very much to be very the security-based incentive, but if we make it an economic regime, it seems like that would be a much more successful way.
Yeah, let's see, so Ken brought up this whole framework of carrots and sticks, and originally it was around knowledge and know-how in peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Today, there's a little bit of a resurrection of an idea that actually was in the Atoms for Peace original plan, and that is to have one international authority that controls material. And so the need for having domestic enrichment capability in individual countries would be eliminated, because there would be an international bank of sorts for nuclear materials. That topic is actually being engaged in discussions with Iran. Whether countries buy into that will depend on their confidence and trust of continuing access to material to be able to support their domestic civilian uses. But the concept of having that managed and controlled by an international authority under international protocols is an idea that had interest before, died for a lot of reasons in the dynamics between the U.S. and USSR, but is getting resurrected today with a lot of interest and potential to it.
And we would support that for our own arsenal? We would give up control ourselves of enrichment?
So you're talking about fissile material production?
Yeah, well,
for
the idea you just talked about one international body.
For our nuclear reactors?
There's a lot that I've realized over the years that as the sole superpower, global superpower with nuclear weapons, the first one, there are a lot that we believe it's in our self-interest. We want everyone else to do it, and then maybe at the end of that road, we'll do it also. And that doesn't tend to play very well. It's a little bit criminal. So is that idea one that you actually said that we would adhere to?
So let's see, so make sure we're clear here. So the concept of international bank is for material for our nuclear power. Okay. And I'm not in a position to commit to that, obviously, but that has been discussed quite a bit among federal officials as a strategy that would make some sense to engage in. There was a series of conferences and meetings that took place with the Department of Energy leadership and the national labs through the latter part of the 90s, early 2000s, where that concept was talked about quite a bit as having a lot of potential to it. The other issue you bring up is can we really engage and get all national powers, including China, to step up to fissile material cessation of production? That's another pivotal issue. And there's the holdout is really working the China dimension.
But to follow up on that, if you agree, which I think you sort of alluded to earlier in your talk, that in the long run we're likely to have increased commercial nuclear power generation as an inevitability of dealing with world energy issues, then I mean, isn't that sort of commercial and sort of survival imperative in conflict with the idea of limiting the production of fissile materials? I mean, how can you limit the production of fissile materials as more and more countries essentially produce more and more nuclear power plants that sort of inherently are going to be producing fissile materials?
Right. So the notion is having a international constructive operation or authority that provides the authority for managing that. That's the core of it. I mean, that's back to my original fuel cycle chart, is that if you don't address how the material is managed internationally, how, there's very little we can do to guarantee that we will have ultimate transparency and cooperation to eliminate the covert activities that IAEA struggles to be able to find and to determine. So having an international cooperative authority for the materials management, so the nations don't own the material, is the concept that has been floated in the last 6-8 years.
So it wouldn't be so much a limit on production of fissile materials as a control regime,
Of
a complete control regime for commercially produced fissile materials and power generation, as well as other forms, I guess.
right, it's actually a controlled commodity in a sense, yeah, with international control.
So you said that Canada and somewhere in Africa, that's 30% of the sources. Where are the other
the mining,
sources?
right.
What are the other sources? Where's the other?
I don't have the complete numbers. I don't know if it's in any of the backups there. I'm not sure. Yeah. I mean, we have a fair amount within the U.S. of uranium deposits. Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions in the back. We've gotten into the question session here.
Yeah,
before.
I try to
Maybe
get
you-
answers from them.
Maybe before you ended your talk, but let's go to those. And then we collected some questions from the class, and I'm going to editorialize those a little bit because some of them have already been answered. But let's thank Joan for her talk, and then we'll continue the questions.